All right, Lucas, this is Colby. Let's talk about your running mechanics. So you got this updated new video footage you took of yourself the other day at RunLab, and we put together this movement analysis profile report based off that stuff. So you've got some issues in that left quad area. And so I see some specific things that you're kind of compensating for that right now. And so I'm going to try to touch on some issues that I do see on that left side and just overall your running mechanics specifically. So I'll go through this a little bit different than I would for most patients, just because of I have to explain less of how this works, given you understand all this stuff. So let's just go through each section, look at these limiters, and then we'll go to the video footage. So it starts off with, you actually have a slightly different contact point on the left side when you're in your shoes versus the right side. You have a little bit more of a rear foot strike. You land a little bit more on the lateral foot, and you have a little less bend in the knee, right? So we'll look at that. And then the important part is the connection of this section with this next section and the slight increase in the knee flexion right after that. So it says decreased left knee joint excursion. And then thirdly being the hip drop on both sides, with the hip drop on the left being 2 degrees more than the right. So some hip slope there with that, but I think this 9 degrees of extra slope has to do with in conjunction with these other two sections in the knee flexion and the inadequate loading on that side. And then finally, the last thing on the left side, some of that lateral, landing a little bit more on your lateral foot. Your left foot actually fades across your body slightly more than your right. So your stance width on your right leg is wider than your left. So you have a mild crossover, right? So let's talk about those things. Well, first off the bat, all right, we have structural considerations. You have close to having some higher arches, but everything from what I can see in that new updated kind of baseline assessment, everything looks neutral, as well as your range of motion. I did put a mild decrease in your posterior chain range of motion. The fact that you kind of have to bend your knees a little bit to be able to touch your toes, or if you don't bend your knees, you kind of only going about 3/4 of the way down your shins in terms of that. So this is a mild decrease in your posterior chain range of motion, but your big toe looked good. And so did your ankle dorsiflexion and plantar flexion in terms of walking on your toes and walking on your heels and doing those different movements, right? So let's look at the contact point, right? And let's see the difference in. So look at the small differences here. So foot is in the air, right foot touches the ground right here. See how when your right foot's coming through, you're hitting just almost all the way through that entire midfoot. It's like the entire contact point covers that whole midfoot, from the rear foot to the midfoot. It's a real high surface area of impact through the entire foot. Then look at the left foot, more hitting on that rear foot. It's not that this is a bad striking point, right? Obviously you have great running mechanics overall, and you're somebody that we would use as an example for somebody doing good things, but we're trying to nitpick what's going on with you here. This is an interesting part, that you're landing more on that rear foot with some space up underneath your toes, right? So one thing that I wanted to touch on here for you with that is one thing I explained to patients is just understanding that your foot's the only thing coming in contact with the ground when you run. And at the initial striking point, it's the most important time to be in the right position of the foot, right when you hit the ground, to begin to dissipate that impact, right? The foot does a good job to dissipate and store energy. And so when you land with a good high surface area through the midfoot and running at the speed that you're running at, it's the ideal way to do that. The further you get back on your rear foot and the more space you have up underneath your toes, the lower surface area that you're going to impact, and the less that you're going to be able to dissipate and store energy through the foot. So you create less spring-like effect with the ground and put a more strain on the bones and the joints through the lower leg. Now also, in conjunction with what's kind of creating that position, is that you're landing with this knee flexion, 156, 165. So about 9 degrees of difference here. And it comes from the angle of your shin. If you look at 90-degree angle of your shin coming straight down from your knee as your right foot hits, angle of your shin on the left about 7 degrees out in front of your knee, right? So you want that shin angle to be closer to 90 degrees. That's just loading up the force vectors, protecting that lower extremity by having that be more 90 degrees right up underneath the knee, allows your quad and glutes to be more engaged, to land soft, absorb impact, right? So there's where you're hitting more on your rear foot with less bend in your knee on the left in comparison with the right, right? So we can see this next step, just so you know, it's not just one step. Right leg, full foot contact, 90-degree shin angle. Left foot comes through. More on the rear foot, kind of toes pointed up towards the sky a little bit more. And that angle of your shin going out about 7 to 8 degrees. So that's what starts your issues, okay? And I'm not quite sure if this is, you've been doing this and this was what's starting to create that issue on that left quad, or if this is how you're compensating right now because of having some issues there right now, right? It's kind of comes down to working with you in person through those follow-up gait training sessions with our doctors and teams in person to find out the exact mechanisms of why this is happening and what to do about it. But I can see it as a compensation for sure, right? So hopefully that makes sense there, looking at the shin angle and the foot position as you land, and the knee flexion is kind of in the same thing as the shin angle. So let's talk about the loading response. We'll talk about the lateral foot angle and the crossover step together, but I want to talk about the loading response too. So we talked about how you're about 24 degrees. So let's just get some hard numbers to work off of right here. So 52, 152, so 28 for 16. All right, so 16 degrees on the left as you land, 28 on the right as you land. And let's talk about this spot right here. Now, I measured a bunch of steps, and most steps on your left are like this. 8 degrees more knee flexion at your lowest point on the left versus the right. So you went from what, 12 degrees less, or 10 to 12 degrees less right when you hit, to 8 or so degrees more at your lowest point. So that means that the change in the knee flexion is 20 degrees more than the change in the knee flexion on the right, right? So that's the important part, is you're collapsing in the change of the knee flexion on this side. And this is really going to drastically increase the load and strain on that quad, because one, you're collapsing down pretty far. This 55 degrees of knee flexion is really on the high end of kind of the most amount of bend you would want to have in your knee, versus 133 is kind of right in the right range, where we're looking at 45 degrees or so is the angle we're looking for as kind of to work from. So this is a pretty high amount of bend in the knee on that left. So it's this kind of over collapsing on that side, collapsing too low, going from not much bend to then too much bend, right? So I think the connection of those two things is what is really putting the extra injury risk and strain through there. Because what this does is, picturing your leg like a spring, your leg acts quite a bit like a spring when you run, especially you. You're somebody who harnesses a lot of that spring-like energy and that quick ground contact time and that efficiency as a runner. You're not really somebody who is grinding it out and relying more on kind of muscle. You rely quite a bit on that spring-like capacity, and you get this nice long stride length, and you have quite a bit of speed. Meaning, and so coming from your background, I can see in you and your footage, and just knowing you're past somebody who you're going to rely more on that spring energy. And so you're taking away so much of that spring energy on that left side. And that makes you have to really actually even use those quads because you're getting down in such a low position, really having quite a bit of knee flexion. And the increased change in that knee flexion tells me that you're going to have a longer ground contact time, less of an efficient spring, right? Picture an efficient spring has the right amount of give, but the right amount of stiffness. And you have too much give and not the right amount of stiffness on this left side, okay? And that's what's getting this quad going on that side. Or just really that whole left leg. I could even potentially see some calf and Achilles issues on that side stem from this as well. But you seem pretty good there. So it's taking away that spring energy, and that can create that longer ground contact time. So just thinking about your right foot versus your left foot's probably going to be on the ground for a couple hundredths of a second longer every single step you take on the left versus the right, right? And so now that creates compensations as you're not quite symmetrical, and that dragging that left foot and having it stuck to the ground longer makes you have to just work harder to try to, one, from this low position, drag this foot to get it off the ground behind you and work harder to push off. Okay, so figuring out how to land in a better position with a little bit more knee flexion and a better foot position, and then control that and decrease that collapse and harness that spring-like stiffness, if you will, right? Because that's really what I see for you as the main limiter. And so I think it's kind of adding up to quite a bit of things of having to work harder on this side, creating longer ground contact on that side, and just being in a not a very good position at the initial contact to appropriately begin absorbing that force in the right places. So hopefully that all made sense to you there, and you can see what I'm talking about in regards. You go from the rear foot strike on the left with the decreased knee flexion right when you contact to then slightly increased during that loading response, right? So it says increase knee flexion from about 9 to 15 degrees at the contact point, modify initial contact from rear foot to midfoot. So essentially just saying, get this left striking point at the foot and the knee to look like the right, and then decrease the left knee joint excursion. Excursion meaning the change, right? How you went from decreased at contact to increased at the lowest point. And so the amount of change is double the amount of the right. And so the next limitations we've got to go through here at mid stance, we're going to see the decreased hip stability on both sides, but the left side being more. So let's take a look at the rear view on both sides to see that. I think working on your single leg stability and your hip stability on the left side is going to help you quite a bit, because I see that you've got some hip drop on the right, but I'm not that worried about it, because this is something that has in all the video footage that I looked at of you from previous years. You always have had kind of that hip drop. So here's one from 2019, same kind of thing. Looks very similar. But then look at, you actually look a little worse on the left right now. The thing that looks worse to me is kind of this spinal curve. You have it some here, but it's worse, I think, on this new footage. So this left side, when you're on that left foot, the hips drop by a pretty good amount. I mean, that's 8 or 9 degrees is a pretty good amount. You see kind of this arm thrown out here, but then I think this kind of curve in your spine is a little bit worse as you're kind of like trying to lean over this left side to keep yourself balanced over that left leg. So this just adds on top of those other issues that you're having on that left side. I think certainly working on the hip stability, because if we look at the side view, we talked a bit about that knee flexion. Well, those three joints through your leg are all acting in tandem, right? Starting with the ankle, the knee in the middle, and then the hip. So if you have a weak spot, which we can see that there's some stability in that hip that's not quite there, it's going to put more strain and reliance on stability and a higher mechanical load and injury risk on the knee and or the ankle, right? So I think that working on hip stability is going to be a specific thing that helps you control that knee. It's just overall single leg stability, right? If you're landing and that hip's collapsing and you can see some of that kind of curve in the spine, it's going to just make it way harder to control that knee flexion. So you look when you're on your right leg, the hip drop is 7 or 8 degrees, but your spine is way more neutral and your arms stay more neutral. So you're more way, even though you have some slope in the hips on the right foot, you're way more balanced when you're on your right leg, right? Versus, see how you just hit, this elbow goes out, this elbow kind of goes out, this hip drops, and then the thing is like that spinal. I know this line, I'm making it look worse than it is, but it's hard to get it to draw exactly how I want it, but there's an extra little spinal curve there. So I think single leg stability and hip stability is going to be important for you too, specifically on that left side. So when I'm talking about those issues we started with the collapsing, looking at it from the side view, looking at it from the rear view, this hip collapse is also occurring at the same time. And it's kind of this this one thing I wanted to touch on for you is that if you have that extra hip slope and you're out of alignment on that left side, you definitely have some hip drop on the right, but it's worse on the left, right? Well, you're gonna have to work harder to get the same amount of stride length and power, as the majority of that's coming from the glutes and that hip joint as you go to push off. So on that left side, you're gonna just be, because you're in that compromised position, it's gonna be harder to create the same stride length, right? So it can just be something that's taken away from your running efficiency as well. It might actually have you meet, because of the hip weakness, trying to push more through the calf and Achilles and the foot to create that power. Okay. So the last limitation here for you to have, and sorry if I'm getting a little bit long-winded, I'm past my 15-minute mark. I'll try to keep it under 20 minutes here. It's this, looking at this front view. Now I have your barefoot videos and I have some of your old videos. Really your barefoot looks pretty much the same. You strike less on the rear foot on your left side when you're when you take your shoes off, right? So you're able to land more midfoot when you take your shoes off, which is interesting, but then you still kind of have the collapsing issues there. The older video footage, basically you're landing with a better shin angle, more bend in the knee, and more of a midfoot strike on your left side in the older video footage. So not that your running form has gotten worse, but on this left side, I think you're compensating right now, right? As that's really the main differences I can see, is that you're actually in the good striking point that we want to see in the older video footage. But let's look at the two things here from the front. So let's look at, so when you hit on this left foot, see how you have a little bit more of an increased lateral foot angle, about 15 degrees here versus 7 or 8. So that lateral foot angle when you land on the left, right? We saw that there in that very first section, 12 degrees versus 6 degrees. Landing more on that lateral foot on that left side. So another thing that we talked about, how the foot needs to be in the right position, right, as you strike. Landing more on the lateral foot means you're on a lower surface area, and you're gonna put more strain on the lateral part of the leg, as the ground reaction force is gonna follow from where that foot lands. but really why you're landing more on your lateral foot is, let's get this left foot to the more of the narrow stance on that side. So if I draw 90-degree line, and this 90-degree line from your belly button straight down. Now look at where this right foot goes. It comes toward that line, but basically right on it, right? Barely crosses it, just a sliver of that. Versus, look at how much where this foot comes at and how just a little bit more of that foot's coming across. Just consistently, that left foot wants to come across. And then here's a particularly maybe the worst step that you have within the new footage is over half your foot's coming across that time. So that left foot wants to come across your body a little bit more and wants to land more on that lateral side. So again, kind of painting a picture of trying to tie in all these issues together to understand what's coming in, you know, what your issues are. Well, the further you come across your body here, the less balanced and stable you'll be on this leg, which can help, which is going to increase the knee collapse and the hip collapse. So that crossover step is going to increase both of those things. So by controlling that stance width and stopping that left foot from fading across your body is going to be something that's important, controlling that stance width on that left side. And I think it's just overall, you've kind of got some weaknesses and some coordination you need to work on with that left leg when it's in the air and when you're landing on it, right? And the position that you're landing in is kind of making you collapse. And that's what your final limitation is going to be there with the mild crossover step on the left, right? So right foot more consistently staying wide, left foot wants to kind of fade across your body and land on the lateral foot more because of that, right? And you can see how that's going to double down on the other issues you have, right? So for you, this shoe anatomy recommendation didn't give much, right? There's only these 4 parameters to come into play here. And I mean, it's pretty general: straight last, moderate to wide forefoot, 6 to 12 millimeter offset, which is kind of covering the general range, and then 1 lighter training shoe plus 1 long run shoe. If you're somebody who trains a little bit more than the average person, right? So you probably need some different shoes in your rotation instead of just 1 pair of shoes. So yeah, I think that the shoes you're in are a great shoe for you. I think you have the right idea of, you know, shoes that work for you, and that's not much of a sticking point for you at all. So the last page of the board is just going to summarize what I just talked about and explain where we go from here. So basically, just quickly recapping, the biggest limiters are a rear foot strike with decreased knee flexion at initial contact on the left, followed by the increased knee flexion during loading on the left. Then you have the contralateral hip drop, with the left being a little bit more severe, and then the crossover step also mildly on the left. Okay, so yeah, I hope this was helpful for you and kind of makes some sense to you right now, and seeing kind of the issues you're dealing with and how that's playing out within your running mechanics right now. And you can kind of maybe talk with me or Dr. Alice or Dr. John Love or, you know, Dr. Bauer, everybody and the team there at RunLab to use this report to start to put together a plan of action, different gait exercises to start trying to take care of this stuff. And maybe just, you know, anytime you want to hop on the treadmill when you're in there at RunLab and take a look at these issues, it should be easy enough to, now that you see the things that I see, run it by the other doctors and see kind of what's going to be the best plan to start trying to take care of this stuff. So yeah, that's what I see going on with your running mechanics. I'd love to kind of get your feedback on that stuff. Hopefully it wasn't too long for you. Hopefully you had about 25 minutes to get through this stuff. And it's just whenever I'm not talking to a regular patient, sometimes I tend to ramble on and I kind of get out of my normal succinct way of doing things. So yeah, thanks again. And yeah, it was fun to go through this stuff here with you. So have a good one. Bye.